Alice and I are always looking to be more healthy, and we were just talking about how fasting is one of the best ways to do that, but it's so hard. But the great thing about Prolon is that's not what you're doing. It's not that you're not eating for 5 days. Instead, you're using their science-backed program to convince your body you're fasting.
You guys, this 5-day program really is amazing. It comes beautifully packaged and it does all the thinking for you. Each day is its own box. And by following their program, I know I just feel so much better. And I can't wait to experience Prolong Next Gen and continue to see results. For a limited time, you can be first in line to experience the new Next Gen at special savings. Prolong is offering the Prosecutors listeners 15% off site-wide plus a $40 bonus gift when you subscribe to their 5-day program. Just visit prolonlife.com/prosecutors. That's PROLONLIFE.com/prosecutors to claim your 15% discount and your bonus gift. prolonlife.com/prosecutors.
Hey guys, this is Brett from the Prosecutors. I hope you enjoy this week's ad-free episode. And if you do, consider joining our Patreon, where every week is ad-free. You also get to talk to us and live get vocals. You'll get your episodes early and often, and you can enjoy our newest addition to the Patreon page, Sidebars, where you will get unfiltered, unscripted opinions from both of us. Once again, enjoy the episode, and we will see you soon. I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we conclude our investigation into the death of Yvonne Layne. Is David Thorne in prison for a crime he didn't commit? Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I'm Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my remarkable co-host, Alice.
Brett, that was so nice. I needed that after a very full and wonderful but exhausting weekend with my children.
Well, you are remarkable. I'm sure they think you're remarkable. Thomas thinks you're remarkable. That was Thomas's. Thank you, Thomas, for providing
Thomas,
today's
that was
descriptor
so kind.
for Alice. Yes. And thank you to all of you who've been sending those in. It makes my life so much easier. I don't have to come up with something to describe Alice as, which is really hard because I'm just not that good a liar, but I do what I can.
Just always telling the truth, Brett. Always telling the truth.
I can't let your head get too big, Alice. People already love you inordinately, so we don't want it to all to go to your head. You lose that humility that has endeared you to so many.
You can't see me on the floor passed out from laughing.
Uh-huh.
But we have a mission today. You said in the introduction that we are going to conclude Yvonne Layne's story today. Can we do it, Brett? I don't know. We like to talk.
We're going to do it. We're going to do it. No matter how long it takes. So buckle in, everybody, because we are going to conclude this story today. And so let's just dive in. We won't waste any more time chit-chatting. I know a lot of you hate chit-chat anyway. And so we've talked about several things. We've talked about the timeline. We've talked about the statements that Joe made, which obviously are very important in this case because, as we have said repeatedly, not to repeat myself, if Joe is telling the truth, David is guilty. If Joe is not telling the truth, then there's a lot of reasonable doubt about whether or not David is involved. So we went through that. We pointed out some of the problems and some of the holes. But as we've often said, every statement, every confession is going to have issues. It's just the way humanity works. So what you really have to do is look at the supporting evidence. We looked at some of that last time with statements by other people who had come in to talk to the police about what they knew about this murder. And today we're going to talk about some more of the concrete evidence in this case. We're going to try and line that up and see whether it fits with what Joe said. I want to start with David's theory of this case. It's pretty interesting because we know what David thinks happened here. David has told people that he thinks that one of Yvonne's children's fathers, Eric, who we've talked about before, who was in prison at the time of this case, was involved in her murder, that perhaps he had hired someone to kill Yvonne. And I believe David said this before David was arrested and charged, which is interesting to me. It's interesting that his theory is the police's theory, just with a different suspect. I found that interesting and wanted to share it with you guys. Don't know that it means anything. I guess if David's guilty, it might, because then he's sort of projecting his own guilt on someone else, but I don't think it tells you whether he's guilty. Just sort of an interesting thing to throw out there to set the stage as we continue to look into this case.
Absolutely. So, we've already talked a lot about Yvonne, but Yvonne's life really was complicated. She had 5 kids by 4 different men. She was dating multiple men at the same time. She was also a sex worker. And none of this is to cast aspersions on her, but it's to set the scene because it's important, especially with respect to David's theory. If his theory is that one of these men that are intimately involved with Yvonne had to do with her death. Now, David knew about Yvonne's dealings with other men because he would drive her to conventions around Ohio and surrounding states where she would make money as a sex worker. None of this is to blame Yvonne, like we said, but there's no question that her life was inherently dangerous. If you are working at these conventions, I mean, she's not just a kind of on-the-side sex worker. She would go to these conventions where these businessmen from all over would be there for work and then also want, sex for money at night. That's dangerous because you're in a room alone with a man who may or may not want their secret to get out. Money's involved, sex is involved. It just puts a woman in a very vulnerable position. There is even some evidence that she was not above blackmailing some of the men she'd had business arrangements with, some of whom may have been Alliance police officers. That gets this situation even more hairy.
Yeah, and it's important what Alice said. There is a difference between victim blaming and victimology. And while I think it's important that we not engage in victim blaming, it's also important not to let our reticence to do so prevent us from looking at the life of the person, looking at the sort of the vulnerabilities that their life might present, the danger points. And Yvonne was living on the edge, and it certainly put her in the crosshairs of probably multiple different people. As Maggie has said on Murder and Alliance, there were a lot of people who probably had a motive to kill Yvonne. And when you're thinking about whether or not David's involved, we've talked about this a lot, and everybody knows it. When someone's murdered, the first person you look to are their intimate partners, the boyfriend, the husband, the wife. And in this case, Yvonne's got a lot of those, and people who might not be too happy with her. So I do think it's interesting, and I think it sort of creates a little bit of doubt, because when there are so many people who are potential suspects, it makes you wonder whether or not the police got the right guy. Turning to sort of the evidence in this case and some of the cold, hard facts, I think one good place to start is the cut. And by that I mean the cut on Yvonne's throat. If you've seen the crime scene and autopsy photos, which you can see if you are a patron with Maggie's show, she actually has put the entire case file up on her patron page, and so you can really dive into this case. And if you've seen those photos, you know it is a vicious, deep cut, essentially from ear to ear on Yvonne's throat. But one thing about the cut that I find particularly interesting is that it is clean. And you can see that, especially on the autopsy photos. When you look at that photo, you can tell this is a clean slice, and it's deep. The cut measured 4 inches in depth. And that brings us to the knives.
Well, quickly, Brett, let's talk about why it's important that it's a clean cut. Clean cut meaning it was one swipe, it was deep to begin with. In other words, someone meant to essentially almost decapitate her, right? There was no turning back. There was no second thoughts. It was a cut meant to end it all immediately. And there's no, if it's jagged, it means that the knife has come in, out. If there's a fight, then there may also be jagged edges because maybe she's pushing, the killer's hand away. But here there's enough force that it probably happened so quickly that it all happened in one foul swoop.
And Alice is right. And as we talk about the scene, you just have to ask yourself, Joe's had some run-ins with the law, but as far as we know, he's not violent. He's never done anything violent to anyone. Could he have done this? I mean, could he have engaged in such a vicious crime without hesitation? Like Alice said, they went in for the kill, and there was no hesitation about it. So turning to the knives, as we mentioned in the timeline, Joe bought a folding knife from Kmart the night of the murder, and this is ostensibly the murder weapon, and it is what the police pointed to. But there are some problems with it. First, it's only 3.5 inches long. And as we just said, the cut is 4 inches deep. Now, that's not a problem in of itself, and I want to be clear here. Sometimes people are like, well, if it's a 4-inch cut and the knife's only 3.5 inches, there you go. Couldn't have been the knife. No. Small knives can make big cuts. Small knives can make vicious cuts that you would never think were made by that knife. And the knife can certainly go into the wound, down to the handle and beyond. So, the handle could be in that wound as the cut's being made. But here's the problem with that. The cut was clean. And while the knife was 3.5 inches long, at least the last inch of it was serrated. And it's difficult to imagine, to me, how that knife could have made that cut. But it is the knife that Joe led the police to, and the knife that initially returned a preliminary hit for blood, though that could never be confirmed. Joe led the police to that knife. It's possible the knife was planted, but it would have been necessary to find the exact kind of knife that Joe had bought before, or have Joe provide the knife and then plant it.
Yeah, that a lot of planning and a lot of kind of coincidences. The fact that Joe led the police to the knife is, I think, very problematic for David's story.
And remember this, for those of you who think this knife was planted, Joe's never said that. To this day, he's never said that. His story, as we said before, is that he bought that knife. He took it with him to Yvonne's. He then found her dead and kind of freaked out. And when he freaked out, he thought, well, I don't want to be found with a knife on me because she obviously was stabbed to death, so I'm going to throw the knife in the gutter. So the theory that the knife was planted, to me, doesn't really hold water because as far as I know, even to this day, Joe has never said that he didn't put that knife there.
Now, there was also a kitchen knife. A butcher knife was found in a field near Yvonne's home. It was consistent with a set of knives that Yvonne owned, which just so happened to be missing a butcher knife. When the state criminologist compared the knife to bloody swipe marks on a pillowcase in Yvonne's home, swipe marks that matched someone wiping blood off of a knife, the expert determined they were, quote, consistent with and could have been made by that butcher knife. He also stated that the swipes appeared to be, quote, somewhat narrow with the end tapering to a point. The kitchen knife fit that description. Now, an expert hired by the television show Reasonable Doubt concluded that the wound was consistent with the kitchen knife, but not with the folding knife. An unknown fingerprint was found on the kitchen knife.
So this is really interesting. This is your first piece of of concrete evidence that makes you wonder whether or not Joe could have and did kill Yvonne with the folding knife that's been presented as the murder weapon for quite some time. We will come back to these knives as we talk about our theory of this case, but certainly something that gives you pause, that makes you wonder about what exactly is going on here.
Shopify is a platform built for growth, whether you're just starting out or already running a thriving business. From managing inventory to creating a seamless checkout experience, Shopify is designed to handle it all. And it doesn't stop there. Shopify helps you sell everywhere your customers are, online or in person. It's the ultimate tool for turning big dreams into big wins. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/OPP.
So let's talk about the pants. So we know that Rose Moore has described and Chris Campbell described the outfit that Joe was wearing that included some Nike pants. Now, Joe Wilkes led the police to a pair of pants that he claimed he was wearing at the time of the murder. These pants were in the woods. He basically dumped them there. The pants were tested for blood, but none was found. However, they'd been in the woods for months and had mold and other evidence of decay on them that would have made it difficult to find blood, though there are experts who say that depending on the circumstances, maybe you could have found some blood if blood had been on there. I would note that if Joe killed Yvonne by standing behind her and cutting her throat, maybe he wouldn't actually have that much blood on him, even on the pants. The scene may be bloody, but just given how he did it, he might have actually avoided having any blood on him. Now, it's possible these pants were planted, but once again, a lot of forethought would have had to have gone into this, given the state of the pants when they were found with the mold and the decay. That would mean that the police essentially planted these pants months ahead of time in the hopes of eventually framing Joe, which doesn't really fit with the timeline we've set out. Okay, let's talk about the crime scene. We've had experts who've looked at this crime scene. Alice mentioned Reasonable Doubt, which is a television show which had some experts come in and look at the evidence in this case. And the people who've looked at the crime scene say that the crime simply could not have happened the way Joe said it did. Yvonne wasn't killed on the couch. No one cut her throat on the couch. She was standing, looking out the sliding doors, possibly at the puppies we'd mentioned before. After her throat was cut, she was then dragged to the place where she was found. A television and dresser were pulled down on top of her, though the dresser itself didn't fall on her. It was actually held up by another piece of furniture that prevented it from going all the way. The television, however, did end up on Yvonne's body. Joe claimed that he had accidentally knocked over the items on his way out. Doesn't really seem possible, doesn't really fit. Hard to imagine him doing that. But nevertheless, that is what he claimed in his initial statement. Now, the crime scene is one of anger and rage. It does not look like a hit. A table is near where Yvonne had to have been killed. 2 chairs are pushed back from that table. A pack of cigarettes and a lighter sit on the table in between the 2 chairs. Makes you think that what happened here is whoever killed Yvonne sat down with her, had a discussion with her, smoked a few cigarettes. At some point, she got up, turned her back to this person, and they then cut her throat. After cutting her throat, they were so angry that it wasn't good enough that she was dead. They wanted to further sort of desecrate her body, so they, in a rage, pulled down this dresser and this TV on top of her. Another thing that's interesting is there's a bottle of bleach and some rubber gloves on the counter, indicating that someone may have cleaned up some. Now, I haven't been able to find any other evidence of cleaning. It's possible that Yvonne had been cleaning when she was interrupted by whoever this was, but that is interesting, and most people would know that bleach goes a long way to destroying DNA evidence. Perhaps strangest of all, when Yvonne was found, she was on her stomach with her legs spread slightly apart. In between them was a photograph of a young boy. Another photograph of this same boy was found on the counter. No one knows to this day who that boy was.
That's so bizarre, Brett. I mean, that's all of this is devastating. It's very bizarre to have bleach on the table if the killer really did try to clean, to then maybe have looked around and thought, oh, there's no way I can clean all this, and just left instead. Or maybe he just cleaned the areas where he was sitting to make sure no fingerprints were left behind. But you can tell from the crime scene, it was a very bloody scene. It was not ultimately cleaned up, or maybe the person just thought it was too much of a risk to stay to clean it all up. But that picture, they obviously took the time in order to probably spread her legs in order to place the picture there. And the fact that no one knows who this is even more bizarre to me.
Yeah, I think it is definitely bizarre, definitely strange. There's a reason this case is ripe for the kind of coverage that Maggie is doing. Just these weird little things kind of separate it from the other cases that we've seen and the cases that we've covered.
And Brett, the thing is, you're right. This whole crime scene just kind of shouts personal, because the fact that no one knows who this picture is of, so no one in Yvonne's life, no one in Alliance knows who this person is, probably means that Yvonne was the only person who really knew who this was, and clearly she was dead and could not see this picture and could not be whatever, offended, scared, what have you. And it feels like this picture is like the ultimate middle finger to Yvonne, even though it's placed there likely after she is dead. So that's why it screams so personal to me. This picture probably only meant something to Yvonne, to nobody else. So this wasn't meant to send a, threatening message to the whole family, to the other kids, to the other, lovers. It was, I think, meant to send a message to Yvonne, who was dead at that point, which you only do when you are so intimately enraged at someone.
And I feel like it's interesting. I think the other possibility, the only other possibility I can imagine, is that for whatever reason that photograph was also on top of the dresser. And when the dresser was pulled down, the photograph fell off and just happened to land there, which seems like a pretty, big coincidence, right? That this photograph just happens to land in between her legs, feels like a middle finger, feels like an FU. Could be a message to somebody. I mean, it could be that there's only one person who would know who that person is, and they got the message. That's a possibility. But if that's the case, we certainly haven't heard it. So, yeah, I mean, I lean towards this is some sort of... I guess I'll say this. If Joe did it, I think it's an accident. If Joe did it, I think the photo was just on top of the dresser and just kind of fell there. If Joe didn't do it and it was somebody else, then I think it was a definite connection to this crime. So, I'll just go ahead and say I disagree with David. I think David's 100% wrong. The only person who hired anybody to kill her was David. David may have done that, but nobody else did that. If someone else killed her, it was someone who had a personal vendetta with her and killed her in a rage. And it was a rage that wasn't even satisfied by cutting her throat and leaving her to bleed out on the floor. It was a rage that needed even more to satisfy it. And, I'll just put my cards on the table. Of all the things in this case that make me question whether or not Joe did this, the knife and the crime scene are the biggest ones. And I've told that to Maggie, and I've told that to some other people who are involved in this case. To me, if you're trying to prove that David didn't do this, that's where you start.
Now, there were a couple of shoe prints at the house. Joe's shoes were never recovered. Remember, he's the one who led the police to his pants and to his shoes. So the police didn't find those things independent of Joe. But Joe's shoes, they were never found. And so the police improvised. They went to the Dick's Sporting Goods to determine what kind of shoes they were. Because remember, they had the shoe prints, and so they were just kind of buying shoes and seeing if they matched the shoe prints that they recovered. The clerk at Dick's said that the print matched Nike's, which was the kind of shoe that Joe was wearing.
Yeah, and this is an interesting one because I don't know how much, the clerk at Dick's saying, yeah, they kind of look like those shoes really tells you much. I mean, this is a piece of evidence that was used against Joe. And you'll see it if you look at the appeals and the transcripts in those appeals and the decisions in those appeals. They will point to this fact that the shoes were matched as evidence. To me, number one, I mean, this is in the 70s. It's the 90s. Nikes were pretty popular. Everybody was wearing Nikes. I was wearing Nikes. So it wouldn't surprise me if multiple people owned these shoes. That's the first thing. The second thing, it's not as if the teenager at Dick's is an expert on shoe comparisons. So I don't know. I don't know how much stock I put into this. I guess it's interesting that there's at least some similarity. They couldn't rule it out, right? They couldn't say these were definitely Adidas. They couldn't do that. So maybe it's significant for that purpose. But as far as bringing Joe in, I think it's a little bit weaker maybe than the prosecution would want you to believe.
A neighbor of Yvonne's, Daniel Rogers, came forward and told detectives that he was walking his dog on March 31st, 1999, when he saw a man get out of a car, walk up to Yvonne's door, feel around the frame of the door, and enter the house. Now, this obviously couldn't be Joe, as he walked to Yvonne's house because he did not have his own car. And so what this indicates, I assume what he's talking about when he says that someone's feeling around the frame of the door is if you have a spare key, you probably hide a key. You know, the least creative place to hide it is on the frame of the door right above it. But I don't know that this person necessarily needs to do it because we know that Yvonne's door was not locked. But we also do know that there was no sign of forced entry. So if the door was locked, this person who walked in the house knew where a spare key was, which indicates someone who is very intimately involved with Yvonne.
And as we've said before, if you're a defense attorney, if you're putting on the defense, you don't have to prove what happened. You don't have to, find the guy who did it and have a Matlock moment where they admit it on the stand. All you have to do is put doubt in the jury's mind. And what you're trying to do when you talk about other people being there is say, look, could have been somebody else. This person who was there on the day she was killed wasn't Joe. We know that for certain. He drove there. And Joe's story is that he walked right in. He didn't feel around for a key. So this is somebody else who could have been involved in this case. And Daniel Rogers is not the only person who reported seeing another person at the house. And that brings us to George Hale. We're going to talk about George Hale. It's going to take us down a little bit of a legal rabbit hole. But since you guys enjoy those so much, you should enjoy this as well. George Hale said that he saw a guy coming out of the house carrying a garbage bag. And that's pretty interesting because now you have somebody who's saying a different guy went into the house than Joe. And then you have George saying he saw someone coming out of the house on the same day carrying a garbage bag. And when George was presented with a lineup that included both David and Joe, he said none of those people matched the description of the person he saw. He did say eventually that one of them matched the description of an Alliance police officer, which is interesting, particularly if you think there's some sort of conspiracy at foot here, or maybe some involvement by the police, but not Joe and not David. Now, what's interesting about George Hale, the prosecution and the police did not turn over this statement to the defense. So the defense at the time of the trial did not know about George Hale and his statement. And that brings us to Brady. Now, Alice, we've talked about Brady before. Alice educated me that it was Brady versus Maryland, not United States versus Brady, so that was good. I know that now. But as most of you know, the prosecution, and as we've said before, the prosecution is required to turn over all potentially exculpatory evidence that is material to the defense, so the defense can use that in its trial, in its presentation, and they did not do that here. And so after he was convicted, and once he learned that this evidence existed, David moved to have his conviction vacated on the basis of this Brady violation. And there are a lot of people who feel like, yeah, that's a really good argument. So David should have his conviction vacated and he should get to go free. But that's not what happened. As a matter of fact, this case went all the way to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. We've talked about this before. The United States Supreme Court is the top court. Then you have the Circuit Courts of Appeals, which cover a group of states. Ohio is in the Sixth Circuit, so that's why the Sixth Circuit is considering this. And then underneath the circuit are the district courts, which are your trial courts. And so the trial courts, they handle it at first, and then it goes to the circuit court. Now, these are federal courts, and the reason these are federal courts is because when you've been convicted of a crime, and you've sort of exhausted your state appeals. So if you want to appeal, the first thing you do is you appeal in your state. And the appeal goes up to your state Supreme Court. And the state Supreme Court makes a decision. And then the only person you can appeal to from there, or the only court you can appeal to from there, is the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court is the only court that can overturn the state Supreme Court. So let's say you lose. As we've said before, United States Supreme Court takes very few cases. They're probably not going to take your case. So now you've lost your direct appeal. You've lost your state appeal. You're sad. And all of a sudden, you learn that this George Hale guy is out there. Well, you don't file another state appeal. What you do is you file for something called the writ of habeas corpus. very old thing, goes all the way back to jolly old England. Won't bore you with a history lesson, but essentially it's a way that you say, hey, I'm being held illegally, help me. And you file that in federal court. So you file your federal habeas appeal and you say, hey, these state guys, when they were prosecuting me, they withheld all this evidence. They didn't give me this evidence. And that violated my constitutional rights. I have a constitutional right under Brady versus Maryland to have all that evidence. So let me out. And at the end of the day, David loses this case. And so I'm sure you're all asking yourself, why? Alice, why did he lose?
First of all, we should say a lot of people may be thinking the judges must have some, political sway here, or they have some outcome they wanted. But you should know that this Sixth Circuit decision was unanimous, and the judges were appointed by presidents on both sides of the aisle. One was a Clinton appointee, one was a Bush appointee, and one was an Obama appointee. So first, the Sixth Circuit said, quote, there is little doubt that the state withheld evidence. By the way, that's very damning, and you do not want to hear that when you are the state. But that's not enough. You must also show that evidence is material and favorable to the defense, either because it's exculpatory or impeaching, and there must be a, quote, reasonable probability that had the evidence been disclosed, the result of the proceeding would have been different. You guys have heard this theme over and over in the law. It's not just enough that someone messed up. You have to show that there was a material effect of that evidence not coming in here. Now, the court went on to say, quote, Thorne's many claims, even taken cumulatively, cannot reasonably be taken to put the whole case in such a different light as to undermine confidence in the verdict. In other words, it doesn't matter. It wouldn't have changed the outcome even if they had the evidence that had been withheld from them. You may be thinking this sounds unfair. The state should not have done that, but it would have made no difference in the verdict. And we talked about this. This is the right outcome. Otherwise, any sort of technicality, and there will be no perfect trial. It is impossible to have a perfect trial. Then everyone could essentially get a new trial based on technicalities that would not have changed the outcome. And there would never be any finality to these sorts of prosecutions. There would be no finality for the victims. There would be no, really finality even for the defendants, which is exhausting and expensive to continue down kind of these rabbit trails that don't actually lead to different outcomes.
Yeah, as we've said before, whenever you point to an error, something that went wrong, a problem, you have to show that it mattered. And if it didn't matter, then we're not going to waste everybody's time. We're not going to upend finality. We're not going to waste the victim's time. We're not going to do this again if it wouldn't have made any difference, because the whole idea is, well, if we had another trial and you put this on, it wouldn't matter. The jury would hear it and they would be like, okay. And then they would find you guilty again. And when you dive into the case, you can see what the court says about that. They actually found the testimony was neither exculpatory or material. So it wasn't important, and it didn't really go that far to proving David didn't do it. And that was really based on Hale's testimony is really undercut on cross-examination. So what we told you, that he saw someone leaving the house with a garbage bag, that's what he said on direct. And that sounds pretty powerful. But on cross-examination, he said that he saw, quote, a guy around the house carrying a garbage bag, which is, quite different. And I'll read you what the cross-examination, how it went. In fact, you don't know exactly where this person was even when you saw him. You can't even remember that, can you? No. You don't know for sure that he was in that house, do you? No. You don't know what he was carrying in that bag, whether it was the actual garbage or something else, do you? No, I don't. He further went on to say that the person did not strike him as unusual. They were not covered in blood. They did not have a weapon. They weren't doing anything that would cause suspicion. The only reason he even remembered the person was after he discovered there had been a murder. He remembered there was somebody around there with a garbage bag. So you can see how on cross-examination, suddenly this becomes kind of a big amount of nothing, right? He didn't see, or at least on cross, he says he did not see, and he cannot say for certain that this person was coming out of Yvonne's house. So it might have been the neighbor with the garbage, for all we know. And think about what you're asking. You're asking to overturn a murder conviction, really 2 murder convictions, because these people are so closely tied together, in which you have a confession, in which you have a lot of evidence on the basis of this very vague statement. And the court also noted there was a gap in time between the estimated time of death and the sighting, and it dealt with both this sighting and with Roger's sighting, and basically said even if you saw another person around the home, it did not mean that they were necessarily involved in the murder. And given the number of people who were coming in and out of that house, I think there's some power to that.
So is it material? The court said no, because it's not clear that this information would have affected the strategy. The court said, quote, even if the defense would have utilized different tactics if the suppressed evidence had been known, this is not enough to prove materiality. The defense's chosen strategy at trial, to create doubt regarding Thorne's association with Wilkes, not to raise doubts regarding Wilkes's guilt, might still have been the best one in light of the overwhelming physical evidence corroborating Wilkes's initial confession implicating Thorne. Now, the court pointed to the following facts. They said, to the extent that any newly presented evidence casts doubt on Wilkes's confession, this doubt is easily overshadowed by the fact that Wilkes led the police to a knife in a sewer drain that was consistent with the murder weapon. Second, Wilkes also told the police where they could find the nylon workout suit that 2 witnesses say he was wearing on the night of the murder. 3, there were also a number of telephone calls between Wilkes and Thorne during the days surrounding the murder. 4, motel receipts corroborate the fact that Wilkes, who had no money prior to the murder, presented a $100 bill to pay for the Comfort Inn motel room. And 5th, the state also presented David Thorne's time cards to show that he left work during the middle of the day on the day after the murder, corroborating Wilkes's confession that Thorne picked him up at the motel.
And so I think you can see why it's so difficult to win on appeal, because it's just not enough to point to mistakes. And I feel like what you hear a lot in podcasts and on television shows and documentaries is they just talk about the mistakes. And there's always going to be mistakes. You can have an entire, television series based on the mistakes in a case. But if you don't take the next step and ask, well, is that enough to reverse this conviction? Then you're really falling down. Now, what I think most of you probably notice about the 5 things that Alice just pointed out is we've already sort of cast doubt on some of this, right? Like some of the stuff the court says maybe isn't true. And that is really important, and I think actually probably goes to a mistake that the defense made. I think the defense, they heard about this Brady violation, the supposed Brady violation, and they kind of rushed to court. I really wish Maggie had discovered this, because I think with a defense attorney who did not rush into court with this, but instead of just going with the Brady violation, also talked about the crime scene and the knife and some of the other problems that we've highlighted and the potential issues with the record in this case, I think they might have had more success than they had here, because what the appeals court sees is just there's this mountain of evidence that you haven't contradicted, and you're asking us to ignore that and let the guy out of jail based on the vague recollections of a witness that maybe should have been turned over by the prosecution. And we're just not going to do that. And like Alice said, I do think this is the right call. Whether David is innocent or guilty, this alone was not enough to overturn his conviction. So we've said this before, and now is as good a time as any to return to it. Just how reliable is Joe? I mean, this is the central question at the heart of this case. In his trial testimony, Joe says that he was taking drugs around the time of the murder. Now, we have witnesses all the time who are taking drugs of some sort. If taking drugs meant you couldn't be a witness, you'd have no trials because most of your witnesses are probably going to be taking drugs. As people say sometimes, you don't get your witnesses from the church choir usually, right? There are people who are out there in the streets, people who know things because they are engaged in all sorts of, questionable behavior. But Joe wasn't just taking drugs. He says he was on LSD and cocaine the night of this incident. And those are some pretty serious substances, and substances that kind of mess with your mind and mess with your perception and might make you question whether or not, even if he was telling the truth in his initial confession, whether or not you can trust that statement. And the prosecution, they went after this. The very first questions they're asking him involve his drug use. And they do that because they want to get it out there. They don't want the defense to be able to hammer on this. This is something that prosecutors and defense attorneys will often do. You want to take the sting out with your witnesses. You want to get to whatever the bad part is, address it, and move on so that when the defense talks about it, when they're trying to make hay out of it, the jury's like, well, we already heard that. The prosecution talked about that. No big deal. So the prosecution doesn't try and hide this. They go right to it. Now, interestingly, Joe now denies taking any drugs at all that night. And the interesting thing to me is he now denies that. But actually probably would still be better for David if instead he said, I was high out of my mind. I have no idea what happened.
Joe eventually recanted his confession, so why isn't that enough to get David out of prison? We hear this a lot. Isn't David in prison solely because of Joe's confession? Well, yes, but it's not that simple because recantations are given almost no weight in the law. Here's what the Supreme Court has said about it. Recantation testimony is properly viewed with great suspicion. It upsets society's interest in the finality of convictions, is very often unreliable, and given for suspect motives, and most often serves merely to impeach cumulative evidence rather than to undermine confidence in the accuracy of the conviction. For these reasons, a witness's recantation of trial testimony typically will justify a new trial only where the reviewing judge, after analyzing the recantation, is satisfied that it is true and that it will render probable a different verdict. That's in Daubert versus Wainwright, a case from 1984. This is a long-standing principle within the law. And again, you see that same theme we heard from the Sixth Circuit opinion. Not only do we have to have a different fact, it has to be so different that you would likely have a different outcome.
And remember, Joe's in jail for basically forever. I don't know if he's eligible for parole at some point. He's still in jail today. David obviously is in jail without parole, so he's in jail till he dies. Joe I think he got like life plus 40 or something, so he's in jail for a very long time. And he has a motive to lie. We talked about his motive to lie when he confessed. His motive to lie when he confessed is, David's going to try and pin this on me. The best thing for me is to say, yeah, I did it, but he told me to do it, and I'll testify against him. But once he testifies, and he gets whatever he's going to get, and it wasn't much, then his motive changes completely. Then his motive to lie is to say, oh, I made that all up. That was a complete fabrication. I'm totally innocent. I was just there to invite her to a party or maybe to have sex with her, but that's it. I found her dead. I didn't do anything. He didn't do anything. You should let us out of jail. Right? I mean, that's his motive. And what reason do you have to believe him? As a matter of fact, his initial recantation is a lie. It is clearly a lie. You can tell it's a lie just by looking at it. And Joe today will tell you it was a lie because he has now told you what he says is the real story, which is he went over there to have sex with her. There was no party. If he rented the room, it was to get Yvonne to come back to his room. He wasn't planning some big party. And that makes sense because the evidence of him planning a party was so ridiculous that and ridiculously absent that it was clear he wasn't doing that. So that's just a sort of a good example of why you shouldn't necessarily believe a recantation, because even his initial recantation was a lie. Even if he's telling the truth now, he was lying then, and it doesn't get rid of the other evidence, right? I mean, we talked to you about the other evidence, the other statements he made to other people. That doesn't go away just because Joe now says that his statement is false.
One cannot discuss this case without talking about corruption in the Alliance Police Department. As Maggie Freeling has discussed on her podcast, the Alliance Police Department had its problems. Most prosaic, the people investigating the crime were really not that experienced. The lead detective on the case had never investigated a murder before and would never investigate a murder again. Maggie reported that he would later leave the force, and it was not on the best terms. I want to also note, though, the lack of experience is also Alliance, right? Alliance is a small town where this sort of thing doesn't normally happen. And we see this in several of the cases we've covered where small towns are just not equipped to handle these kinds of gruesome crimes that happen once in a lifetime. And we always try to differentiate between maliciousness or corruption and just inexperience. So keep that in mind here. Most people who look at this case think it must go beyond that. And for David to be innocent, it may well have to be the case that this is a complete and total frame job. After all, there are certain things that police incompetence do not explain, namely the statements of the witnesses. A viable theory of corruption by the police would have to go something like this. The investigation is cold and at a complete standstill, or more sinisterly, the police realize one of their own is a viable suspect and they need a patsy. So they want it to be David, and maybe they even believe that David is responsible, but they need to locate a potential co-conspirator. They learn of Joe Wilkes. They locate Rose and Chris, or maybe Rose and Chris decide on their own to implicate Joe for reasons that are not entirely clear. Now, assuming the police are the first movers, they feed Rose and Chris the story. They then grab Joe, based on what Rose and Chris have regurgitated back to the police, and they convince Joe that they have him dead to rights and David is going to turn on Joe. The police then reach out to Samantha Pegg, who Joe mentioned to them in his initial interview, and force her to also implicate Joe. They then fake the finding of the knife and the pants, and the rest is history. So that's kind of what has to happen if you think Alliance Police did a total frame job of David.
And, at the risk of someone accusing us of being pro-police again, I hope you realize how absurd that is, that the police did all that and got away with it to this day. That all these people, police officers, witnesses, lots of different people would have to know about this and have decided to remain silent to this day, despite media inquiries, attention, the possibility to be famous, maybe even make some money, may get a reward. They've stayed silent nonetheless this entire time. Now, maybe you think, well, the police would do that because code of silence in the police. Yeah, but what about Rose and Chris and Sam? I mean, they don't have any reason to stay silent. Maybe they feel bad. They shouldn't have lied, but they can just say they were forced to do this. Doesn't seem like there's any reason. You would think they would be beating down Maggie's door to recant their stories, and yet, as far as we know, they haven't. Now, I am not ruling out incompetence leading to problems with the crime scene, not collecting enough evidence. We know there were things that happened at that crime scene that should not have happened. But as far as the frame job goes, and I think you need that. You need the frame job to account for these statements. And don't forget, it's not just these people. It's also the people he was staying with, the Enochs, the things that Joe said to them, the things that they heard, the things that they witnessed. All of this would have had to have been fabricated. And just David would have to be incredibly unlucky because Joe did a bunch of things that would make you think he did this, right? Like he just so happened to buy batting gloves that day. He just so happened to buy a knife that day. He just so happened to stay at the hotel, the motel that day, and pay with a $100 bill. He just so happened to get some money that allowed him to buy a bunch of clothes after the murder. All these things, he just so happened to say that he and David had spent the night together the night before. Just all these things that he said how do you get there? How do you, it just has to be, like I said, that David is really, really unlucky. But the biggest problem I have with this whole, the police framed him thing is Sam. I want to go back to Sam for a second. Samantha Pegg. It's Sam that gives me the most pause. If you look at the transcript and you read it closely, Joe mentions Sam on his own in the first recorded interview with the police. Now, some have suggested that the police knew about Sam before, had already spoken to her, forced her to implicate Joe, had fed this to Joe and said, hey, when we do the confession, we're going to ask you if you told anybody, you should say Sam. So, and it would have to be that way, right? If this were a complete frame job, that's how it would have to have gone. But there is a very simple mistake that the police make that indicates to me that this is not what happens. During the confession, Detective Mucklow asked Joe, did you tell anybody else what you had done? This is a standard question from an officer actually trying to confirm a confession. This is the first thing you would ask them, because if they've told someone else, that is the kind of thing that is going to support what they're telling you now. And Joe responds, one person here in Ravenna, my best friend, Sam Pegg. Then Mucklow makes a very simple mistake, one that makes sense if he doesn't know who Joe is talking about. Do you know where he stays? But Sam is not a guy. Sam is short for Samantha, and Joe immediately corrects him with she. If the police knew who Sam was and were setting up this confirmation, they would not make this kind of mistake. They would never think to make this kind of mistake. They would know that Sam was a woman, and it's such a small thing, it's not the kind of mistake you would insert into your conversation just to add some sort of veracity to your story.
Brett, that was a really good pickup. And again, one of the reasons we always tell you all to go back to the primary source, read the transcripts for yourself. What you just noted, Brett, I have used that to catch multiple of the people I'm interviewing as either targets or witnesses when they mess up on a kind of a gender non-specific name and they say the wrong pronoun when, with a name like Sam. Or I've had Leslie that was actually a man and they said she. And I knew that they were lying to me because they did not actually know the person I spoke of. And so that was such a good pickup and so important when you read the transcript.
And I think it leads us, it leads us to our theories in this case. We've covered the evidence. We've covered the questions, and I really start from Sam on this. Now, I've listened to Maggie's episodes, and I will tell you that from the very beginning, I felt like David was innocent. Listening to David talk, listening to Maggie present the evidence, I just felt like there was something off, that something was wrong here, and I couldn't quite place it, but I just felt like something was off. And when I looked at the wounds, we talked about this earlier, and I thought about the knife, and I thought about the crime scene, it just didn't fit. It didn't fit. And I was really excited about this investigation because I hoped that in really looking at this stuff, they would be able to come to some sort of conclusion about who actually did this. But I have to tell you that now that we have looked through this and really kind of looked at the evidence, I don't know. We'll come back to whether or not David is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But I think Joe killed Yvonne Layne. And I think David was involved. And for me, when it turned, was Samantha Pegg. Samantha Pegg, to me, was such an important witness because she undercuts this theory that the police framed David, that the police set Joe up. I don't think they did. When I read this, I'm reading police officers discovering someone they need to go talk to. And they go talk to Samantha. And Samantha says, yeah, Joe told me that he killed this girl and he did it for David. And when you combine that with what the Enoch said and what Rose said and what Chris said, I get it. There are problems with Chris and Rose's testimony, and you can point to those. And a good defense attorney would definitely point to those in trial. I can't necessarily explain all that. Could it be faulty memory? Could it just, they're trying to be helpful, very helpful, overly helpful? I think Rose is trying to be overly helpful. I think she is probably telling the police things that aren't entirely accurate because she's trying to be helpful. But the overall tenor of her conversation with Joe, it fits. It fits with the timeline. It fits with what Joe was doing. I mean, Joe had just bought that knife. He had been in Kmart. He bought that knife. He comes out into the food court, and there they are. And then he goes and talks to him, and he tells him he's going to do this thing, and he shows him the knife. And Joe puts himself at the scene. I mean, he says he went there. He went there to her house. Now, he says he found her dead, but he puts himself there. And what he told the Enochs, the things he said about hanging out with David and being with David the night before, the things he tells Sam after the murder is committed, but before the police have even looked at him. He's already telling Samantha that he did this. To me, it just lines up that he actually did kill her. Now, I pointed out the problems I have with this, the weapon and the crime scene, and maybe that's where some reasonable doubt comes in, because I can only speculate about that. If I had to speculate, and I will, because this is our podcast and we can do that, I think Joe got to that apartment, that house, that night, and he's about to kill somebody, and he's got this dinky little knife. I think he decided to use the kitchen knife. I think he thought that'll be better. And he grabbed that kitchen knife. And I actually think the kitchen knife is the murder weapon. I think he dumped the kitchen knife in the field, and that's why it's in the field. And I think his story about, dumping the knife in the other knife, the folding knife, in the drain because he didn't want it to be connected to him in the murder, I think that actually is true. And I think he actually did do that. He just did it after killing her with a different knife. Now, the scene, maybe I have a little bit more difficult time with.
Yeah, Brett, I don't disagree with anything you've said so far. I think all the different statements of people who really don't have any motive here, especially the Enochs and Sam Pegg, give me huge pause about David's innocence. And this is also because of, remember, the Peel opinion that pointed this out. Even David's own defense did not try to say Joe didn't do it. I think it's pretty clear that Joe was part of the murder. I think he was the one who killed Yvonne. And I think that's so strong that even the defense for David did not try to say otherwise, because they knew the evidence was all there pointing to Joe doing it. Now, I think Joe makes some statements that, cause question marks, and the evidence doesn't all line up completely. But I think it's because Joe was probably high, as he mentioned, that night, and some of his statements he may think are true just don't quite make sense, whether it be the knife. Maybe he forgot there was another knife that he used. I agree that I think the kitchen knife was ultimately what was used to make that deep ear-to-ear 4-inch deep slit in Yvonne's throat. But I don't think that Joe exhibited rage when he killed Yvonne. And we've talked about the crime scene looking like it was rage-filled, like it was very personal. I think Joe did the killing. However he did it, I think maybe Yvonne was looking at the puppies, or he asked about the puppies, and he came behind Yvonne and slit her throat. And I think that's it. I think he saw the blood. He was probably high, freaked out, maybe wiped the knife, the kitchen knife, onto the pillowcase, and probably left in a hurry. I think the scene looks so personal, and I don't think Joe is able to have all of that personal angst come out at Yvonne because he didn't have that type of relationship with her, that I think a second person probably came to the scene after Yvonne had been murdered. This is incredibly risky. I don't know for a fact, but this is the only way I can make sense of how personal the scene became. It's possible this person knew she was already going to be dead, maybe wanted to check on the scene, maybe wanted to spit on her body, whatever it was. I think it was David, and I think he probably came, maybe dragged her body across. Maybe that's when the dresser and the TV was pushed onto her. I don't think Joe is able to run into it by accident and have that TV fall on her. The experts didn't think that either. I think someone in a rage maybe like a "you deserve to be dead," wanted to do even more damage to her. It was just personal at this point. She was already dead. This TV, the dresser, wasn't actually going to hurt her. It wasn't going to cause her death. She was dead. It was just an extra middle finger to her. And I think that's when the picture was placed between her legs as well. Again, I don't think Joe was capable of doing these intensely, intimately angry actions. I think they point to someone who wanted her dead. Joe didn't want her dead. Joe was just hired to kill her. And maybe that person thought about cleaning up. Maybe that's why the bleach was on the counter, but then decided, who cares? I don't even care. They came prepared. Maybe maybe the person, David, came with gloves and maybe even booties that you can put on your shoes so your feet don't leave marks. And they kind of checked in to make sure the deed was done and to say whatever thing he wanted to say to Yvonne in death.
And I think that makes a lot of sense, actually, and it explains a lot if that were true. I think there's two possibilities. One is that David did come over, and look, you can imagine why he would. So you've paid your not entirely reliable friend to kill this woman. You go to your shoot fight class. You come back home. You've covered the time of death, and that was why you did it when you did it, because you wanted to be able to say, I was across town when she was killed. But at that point, you could go over to her house and see whether or not Joe did it. That actually makes a lot of sense, that you would go over there and see. And you go in and you see you're dead, and maybe you do have a moment of rage. Maybe you even say things like, this is your fault. This is all your fault. Why did you have to do what you did? You totally could see that. That would make sense to me. It would also make sense to me if it was just somebody else, that there was somebody else. A lot of people were in and out of that house. Somebody else comes by. Maybe they're the person that was seen by various other people. They go in, they find her dead, and she might have had stuff on them. The possibility that they knew she had stuff on them, and so the guy with the trash bag, maybe what he was actually doing was finding the stuff she had that was incriminating for them. I think at some point Maggie mentions that there are some videotapes missing. Maybe that was what it was. Maybe they're like, well, she's dead. The police are going to be here. They can't find what she has. They ransack the place, and maybe they do. Maybe they're also mad at her and they pull the dresser on her. I think you're right. I don't think Joe did that. I think somebody else did that. I think somebody else was in that apartment or that house that night. But I also think at the end of the day, based on everything we've looked at, I just can't get past. I cannot get past what the Enoch said, what Sam said, what Chris said, and what Rose said. And to me, the rest of the evidence, if it's inconsistent with Joe doing it and David paying him, it is inconsistent just because we don't know exactly what happened. And it's like a lot of cases where there will always be mysteries about why things were certain ways. And if we knew, we'd know, but we don't. But that doesn't mean that David wasn't responsible. Now, I do want to share what I think is sort of the nightmare scenario for David, and that's that he actually isn't responsible, but that Joe was both delusional and maybe on drugs, and David had said something at some point about, it kind of reminds me, imagine this is a Henry II scenario. So Henry II, yes, he had this good friend. He was a priest, Thomas Becket. But the problem with Becket was he had all these principles. And so he would tell the king and tell the king's nobles when the king was doing something that was wrong. And at some point, Henry II said something like, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And some of his knights heard that. And they were like, well, we could do the king a solid and go kill that meddlesome priest. And so that's what they do. They go and kill him. And then Henry II hears about it, and he's like devastated because this was his good friend, and he didn't want them to kill him, but they did, and they thought they were doing what the king wanted. And imagine if David, in a fit of frustration with Yvonne, maybe the fact that she keeps getting back with her ex-boyfriend when he loves her and he wants to take care of her and make her happy, says something around Joe about, man, I just need to get my kid away from that woman. I wish somebody would just take care of her, right? Says something like that. And then Joe decides David wants me to kill her. And he tells people that. David wants me to kill her. I'm going to kill her for David. And he goes off and he does it. And he kills her for David. And the money is from things like odd jobs and helping his grandfather. And that just makes him look guilty. But everything he says is consistent with what Joe thinks David wants. But it's not what David wants. To me, that's the nightmare scenario, because it both explains what Joe says. Joe is still guilty, but David's not. And if that's what happened, David's never getting out of prison.
Yeah, and sure, that may have happened. I think it's difficult to believe that. But I think you hit the nail on the head on one of our Get Vocals with Maggie when you said the only way David is getting out of prison is if he can prove Joe didn't do it or show who did. And I just don't think that's a showing he can make, which leads us to whether the verdict was correct. And I think the verdict was correct because of all the things that we've talked about here. Unless he can show that Joe didn't do it, which I think the evidence absolutely shows that Joe did do it, or he can show, I don't know, some other person who paid Joe to do it, then the verdict, I think, is correct.
And this is such a good example, I think, of reasonable doubt, because I have doubt, but I don't think it's reasonable. The doubt that I have that David did it is doubt that I think is based on emotion and desire and hope. And just when I heard this story and when I heard David speak, I wanted him to be innocent. I wanted him to be innocent. I went into this thinking he was innocent, that we were going to come to the conclusion that he was innocent. But just the more we looked at it, I can't get there. I can't get there that he's innocent. And so the doubt that sits in my mind about it, I think is unreasonable. I don't think it's reasonable doubt. And I think if I were a juror, I would have to find him guilty.
Well, there you have it. I know. Well, I say that somewhat chuckling because we started this out. We have so much respect for the work that Maggie does, and we were only able to do these episodes because Maggie generously just shared all of her hard work with us. And we told her we were going to look at the evidence and go where it led us. And both of us started at the beginning on episode 1 with like, ooh, after looking at the evidence, we kind of think he's guilty, but I don't know. Let's walk through this. So just know that we did not start this raging to, reach the outcome that we've now reached. We actually got here pretty hesitantly, because we've heard David talk. We've listened to Murder in the Alliance. I want him to be innocent. And Joe seems like a very sad character to me. I think he was struggling with a lot and still is struggling with a lot. And I didn't want this to be true, but looking at the evidence, I think it is beyond a reasonable doubt that David should be sitting in prison.
And I know there are people who are going to listen to this, and I think you're going to fall into probably one of three camps. Either you think David is innocent, you think that the police, either incompetence or corruption, has a lot to do with this, you think that they probably did pressure some people into changing their story. Totally respect that position. I think there are going to be people who agree with us that think he's guilty. And then I think there's going to be some people, obviously, who are sort of in the middle and maybe even sort of discouraged by this. And the one thing I do want to say about this, I think those of you who are involved in innocence projects and in trying to look at whether or not people are guilty, this is just something that's going to happen, right? Like, there are a lot of people who say they're innocent, and some of them are lying. Some of them are telling the truth. And if you thought David was innocent, and you listened to these podcasts and you came to the conclusion that he's not, I don't want that to discourage you from continuing to being involved in these kind of cases and looking at these cases really hard, because there are people out there who are innocent, who are in jail, and they need your help. They need your support, and they need you to look at these cases. And I just think at the end of the day, if you're going to do this, this is going to happen. There are going to be cases where you start off thinking, I think they're innocent, and then you come to the conclusion, no, I don't. But that doesn't mean you should stop. And we talk about Temujin Kinsu a lot. Temujin Kinsu is one where we did exactly what we did in this case. Maggie told a story, and we thought, that's interesting, let's look at that. And he's totally innocent, and he's totally in jail, right? He's totally in prison, and he needs people to support him. And like I said, I don't want this to discourage anyone, because whether David did it or not, there are a lot of people who need your support, and this case should not keep you from continuing that fight. And, one thing I do want to say, Maggie's investigation in this case is ongoing, and who knows what she may uncover. And if she does uncover evidence that David's innocent, it'll be something we'll take into account, something we'll want to look at. So one thing I want to encourage everybody to do, listen to the rest of Maggie's podcast, and who knows what kind of information may come out. Well, Alice, do you have anything else you want to add on this one?
No, but an extra long episode because we promised you all we would finish today. And we did it.
We did. We finished today. And you know, Alice, when this one comes out, it's the end of September, which means the next episode's going to be in October. You know what that means?
Your favorite time of
My
year.
favorite
Horror-tastic.
time of year. And let me just say, you know, we get people who just hate our October episodes. I want to point out to you that last October we did an axe murder, an unsolved axe murder, which is definitely true crime. Hinter Kaifak, definitely true crime. We did a trial with a claim of innocence in Ronald DeFeo. I mean, just because they made a movie about the Amityville Horror doesn't mean that wasn't true crime. We did a ghost ship. We did the Mary Celeste, which is a historical mystery, which we've always done. We like mysteries. We do those. And yes, we did do an exorcism, which was much more sort of Halloween, but it's not as if every episode was completely not true crime. So for those of you who complain about October, just give them a chance. Give the episodes a chance. I promise we will stick to our standard operating procedure. Even if they have some supernatural elements, it doesn't mean we're going to abandon rationality altogether just because it is the greatest time of the year, the spooky season. And I, for one, am very excited about our October offerings we're going to have for you.
I'm personally just excited to see how excited you get, Brett, doing these horror themed
I just
true crime
it's so much fun.
episodes.
So
I know
much
you
fun.
love it, and I'm terrified by them. Let's just put it out there, guys.
And I sent Alice our first one today, so we're all set up to record our first October episode. So we'll be doing that soon. Well, by the time this episode airs, we'll have done Savannah. We'll be out of Savannah. We hope you guys enjoyed Savannah. The Savannah Crime Expo. Hope we got to meet a lot of you guys. We are so excited for that as we record this, and we can't wait to be a part of that. Sure, you guys have a lot of thoughts on David Thorne or anything. Shoot us an email, prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod on all your social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Join us on the gallery to discuss these cases. We have a lot of great discussions on the gallery. We got about 700 people now who hang out at the gallery and have all sorts of differing opinions on these cases and bring a lot to them. So hope you'll be a part of that. We'll see you on Reddit. We'll see you on YouTube. If you are a YouTube listener, hit that like button, subscribe, become a part of the community. That's important for us as well. And don't forget to leave those 5-star reviews on Apple. Well, Alice, as we said, we'll be back next week in October for our first October episode, our extra spooky episode. But until then, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors. I would have just fallen over and died.
I felt like
couldn't
it.
have done it.
I actually, it was one of those things where I felt like a NASCAR driver, and people are like pouring water into your mouth and changing your tires and changing your gas. I will say the support staff were amazing, but it was one of those situations where I'd literally be running down the hall to another hearing, and someone would stick in my hand the papers I needed for the next one, and I was like, I hope it's the right papers. So, in other words, finish this today. I got it. You know
We
me.
can finish this today.
Alice on the ball. As I've just meandered.
And if it's a little long, that's fine.
Yeah. Okay. act together.